Hello, everybody. Firstly, I'd like to thank Peter and the Nautical Archaeology Society for hosting this event. It's great that we can all meet up in this virtual way. I'd also like to thank my colleagues at the European Institute for Underwater Archaeology, particularly its president, Frank Goddio. The paper that you're about to hear is an academic one that I wrote with him. And there's a reference towards the end that if you're interested in looking at that. Finally, I'd like to thank the Hilti Foundation for its generous support and the Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities and their underwater archaeology team, without whom we simply couldn't work. What you're going to see is a team effort, and that I hope will come across during this talk. So the city of Thonis-Heracleion rises to prominence as Egypt's gateway to the Hellenic world over the course of the first millennium BC. It's located at the edge of the Sea of the Greeks and at the end of the navigable Canopic branch of the River Nile. It's a place of surveillance and defense, of trade and taxation, and of the mingling of Egyptian people with sailors, merchants, mercenaries, and travelers who brought with them objects and a worldview that they tried to reconcile with a strange alien culture. Now, the outcome of this meeting of peoples was the designation of Thonis-Heracleion by two separate names, and this reflects its intermediary nature, both geographically and culturally. Thonis, or more precisely, the Hone of Saïs, was its Egyptian name, denoting both its geographical setting in a watery landscape that's not quite the delta and Egypt, nor quite the sea. And you can see that hopefully in this illustration that we have of the city here. It's also called the Hone of Saïs because of its association with the capital city of Saïs, which is effectively Thonis acted as its port and gateway to the west. Now, to the Greeks, it was Heracleion, which is a derivation of the place of the temple of Heracles, which is an attribution that most likely comes about through the process of interpretatio Graeca and the conversation of visitors and settlers who looked for and find shared characteristics between their gods and religious practices and those of the land in which they found themselves in. And so in this case, we get the melding of the god Heracles with the Egyptian god Khonsou. Now, the purpose of this talk is consequently to attempt to understand this form of conversation as it was played out in Thonis-Heracleion. And so we'll do this through looking at the remains of the topography and the material culture that has been discovered in the excavations in the city. Today, you can see on the map here that the city is located about 6.5 kilometers off the modern day coast of Egypt. It's close to the city of Alexandria. It's about 10 meters underwater today. And here, the colored area is an entire 110 square kilometer landscape that has been rediscovered by the team from the IEASM beneath the waters of the Bay of Abu Qir. This landscape had been slowly submerging due to a couple of factors. First of those was the steady compaction of Nile Delta sediments. And then coupled with this, you have the rapid and catastrophic failure of local areas of these sediments due to their overloading. And we'll see both of those processes in action a bit later. So when we strip back this question to its very basics, our approach can be kind of formulated in the question, well, when does Thonis become Heracleion? Which we can consider through looking at these two official Egyptian decrees, which mention the name of the city. And if we look at these, we can see that it occurs as we might expect in the Ptolemaic period, the Greek period. So here on the Decree of Saïs, which is the black one, in hieroglyphs, it's written that the pharaoh Nectanebo commands that the stela be set up at the mouth of the sea of the Haunabut in the town by the name of the Hone of Saïs. Now, this decree is set up around 380 BC. And it can be directly compared with the texts on this other decree, the Decree of Canopus from 238 BC, which is during the reign of Ptolemy III, where in hieroglyphs, it's written that a waterborne procession was made for the god Osiris each year from the temple of Ammon of the Gareb at the entrance of the Hone. whereas the Greek text on the same stela states that the navigation of the sacred bark of Osiris is carried out each year from the temple in Heracleion. So the simplicity of the answer to the question that Egyptian Thonis becomes Greek Heracleion in the Ptolemaic period, however, belies the complexity of this intercultural translation and the gulf between the official language of decrees, the everyday workings of life in this port over the long term, and the continuity of Egyptian culture and its institutions. So instead of just looking at it as going from Greek to Egyptian to Greek, we should think of it more as a kind of melding of cultures. And it's best seen in three snapshots of the Saïte period, the Persian and local dynasties period, and the Ptolemaic period. And so we're going to look at certain aspects of the city from each of these phases to show how this change takes place. In Homer, there's a story which is told by Odysseus to an Ithacan shepherd of his time as a pirate raiding what was most likely the Canopic coast of Egypt. And it's clear that with its prodigious wealth, Egypt is a tempting target to Greek pirates. With its location just beyond the sandbar at the end of the easily navigable westernmost branch of the river, Thonis-Heracleion would have been on the front line of this. And so the defense of the country and its borders and the preservation of the way of Egyptian life was a fundamental aspect of kingship. And from the Old Kingdom onwards, the entranceways to the country were guarded and under official administration. So to get to Thonis-Heracleion, you sail down the northeast channel. And this brings you into the central port area here, where it provided access to the Saïte city up in the north. Now this place is known as to us as the Canopic Gate, and it's of clear strategic importance. And it's of no surprise that it's here that we find military equipment and structures that appear to be defensive bastions and the remains of what was likely to have been a large tower or fortress. So these are some of the military equipment that have been found in this region, and there's a Greek helmet of Chalcidian type. There are three examples of saratours, which are the bronze butt end of hoplite spears, as well as a liberal smattering of sling bullets, and we also found a mould in which to make them. These are all Greek-style forms of military equipment, and they talk about the presence of Greek mercenaries who were defending the city in the 5th to 4th century BC. Now, these soldiers are likely to have been the metaphorical descendants of the men of bronze, the Greek mercenaries who helped the Saïte dynasty gain power and then who helped to maintain them in their rule, and as we can see here, defend the gates of Egypt. Now, it's also possible to speculate that these are the men to whom we should look to for the origin of the name Heracleion. In the north of the city, up in this region, are the remnants of a large temple that was abandoned and then dismantled when the main religious buildings were transferred to the central islands, so down here, between about 450 and 380 BC. And this is because of the rise of sea level in this northern area. This dismantled northern structure is probably the sanctuary which is referred to by the Greek historian Herodotus, from whom, which would also have included a temple to Khonsou, the god whom the mercenaries equated with Heracles. Now, both Khonsou and Heracles are suitably warlike gods, and it's quite clear that for martial men like mercenaries, these are suitable gods for them to worship. Now, mercenaries aren't the only people who are protecting the Canopic Gate at this time. Another sort of defensive bastion also exists, this time a theological one. On an island at the riverine entrance stood a small temple that, according to the ceramic evidence, seems to have been occupied from around the end of the 7th century to the 3rd quarter of the 6th century BC. After perhaps only a few decades of use, it was claimed by the rising waters of the port, and it was abandoned. And from the demolition deposits, there's a whole series of small bronze plaques and other elements of furniture that were discovered, and these are all richly engraved with hieroglyphs. Their texts enable us to know that the Saïte period pharaohs, Psammiticus I and particularly Amasis, were closely involved with the temple. They also help us to reconstruct the role that it and the pharaoh together played in the defense of Egypt. And here with the Amasis plaque reveals the name of the god to whom the sanctuary was principally dedicated, and that's Khonsou-Thoth. This is a composite god of justice. They push back the evildoer. They open the way to the just. Furthermore, from the arrangement of the royal title, it's possible to see that Amasis claims his legitimacy as pharaoh, and at the same time, he claims the role and the functions of Khonsou-Thoth as the guardian of Egypt and its gateway to the Mediterranean. Overall, then, the image that the mercenaries and the priests of the Canopic Gate evoke of the Saïte period port was that it's welcoming to merchants, but at the same time, it's suspicious of those beyond Egypt. And this is really nicely conveyed in this particular text, which is from Herodotus's Histories, and talks about a conversation that Herodotus supposedly had with a priest in the temple of the stranger Aphrodite. And the priest tells to him the story of Helen of Troy, which is what is on the screen. Now, in this particular section, the role that Thonis-Heracleion plays in the story is quite significant. The guardian of the mouth of the Nile is called Thonis, and the temple of Heracles mentioned is most likely the eponymous one that gave Heracleion its Greek name. Also, there's a mention of a right of asylum that this temple could grant, and again, in a much later decree from the city, this grant is repeated. Furthermore, the message in this retelling of the familiar tale of the Trojan War, but of specifically Egypt's part in it, is an interesting one. We're presented with an Egyptian official called Thonis and the pharaoh, who are friendly, courteous, honorable in their dealings with foreigners. But at the same time, it's clear that these foreigners can't be trusted. We can see that in this story that Paris lies to Proteus. Menelaus kills Egyptian children. Now, this is the same message that we have played out in the material remains of the port city from this period. It's a place that's welcoming and open to people beyond the seas. There is a significant amount of Greek pottery, for example, used throughout the city. But at the same time, it's a place that's prepared both militarily and theologically to defend itself and also to defend the gates of Egypt. So in the Saïte period, foreign ships are clearly stopping at Thonis-Heracleion with cargoes including pottery. As of the first landfall in Egypt, it would have been a vital stop for fresh water and for foodstuffs. But more importantly, as far as the Egyptian state was concerned, Thonis-Heracleion is a port of call for taxation purposes. Now, exactly when this started is unclear, but the first evidence may come from a customs papyrus that contains a register of the duties on Ionian and Phoenician ships at a northern port, which is most likely Thonis-Heracleion, and is dated to the Persian period. So the collection of import taxes are a response to the increasing amount of trade which is flowing through this port and the state wishing to benefit from it. We can see this in more detail in the final era of the native dynasty, with the Decree of Saïs, which is illustrated here. Now, this clearly outlines the duties that were levied on all imported goods in Thonis-Heracleion, whatever their origin. So these included gold, silver, timber, processed wood, and the catch-all phrase, all things coming from the Sea of the Greeks. The decree also states that further levies were raised, which would have included both harbour and other local taxes. So as a port located at a transportation bottleneck with a military and probably a naval presence, Thonis-Heracleion was in an ideal location to enforce the collection of taxes on ships as they entered or exited the country. Furthermore, with its temple to Ammon of the Gareb, it also has all of the necessary administrative infrastructure to oversee such taxes and to redirect them to the state and to the other locations. With the increasing volume of goods passing through the port in the Persian and local dynasties period, we can also start to be able to see something of the merchants who are doing this trade. These people can be traced through the finds of their personal weights, sets of which would have been habitually taken on trading voyages to ensure fair dealings in foreign markets. Out of all of our foreign weights, the most diagnostic Greek weights from Thonis-Heracleion are a set of 6 which have Athenian symbols and letters on them, and one of them is illustrated here. The Greek letters, which are mostly delta, eta, mu, and omicron, are the official guarantee for the accuracy of the weight. The symbols, and it's here that we have half a tortoise, indicate the multiple or fraction of the weight system. Now, interestingly, if you look at the distribution map, the red dots are the Athenian weights, and they've all been deliberately placed into the waters of the Grand Canal. Now, these are seemingly deliberate acts, I think, of personal piety, with the weights individually deposited, perhaps in thanks for a successful trading adventure, or in the hope of a safe return home to Athens. Now, alongside the Athenian weights in the Grand Canal, most of the Greek-style weights, which are depicted on the map, lots of the green dots, are in the vicinity of the central island, to which the main temples have now migrated following the abandonment of the Saïd period city. So it's here in the vicinity of the sanctuary to Khonsou, where there is a concentration of small, light weights of both Greek and Egyptian weight standards, alongside lots of coins. And so to us, this could well represent the presence of a market area in this part of the city. The authority who oversees the market is indicated on this coin weight. It's stamped with a design of a ram's head, which is the symbol of the god Amun, and therefore of the temple of Amun of the Gareb. And on the other side of the weight has had hammered into it the reverse of an Athenian tetradrachm of a type in production between 350 and 290 BC. So this object may well have been used as a bridging point between the Persian and Athenian coin weight standards that are in use during the period of the Persian occupation of Egypt. The development of the use of coins in the Persian period is a highly significant piece of cultural borrowing, because Egypt generally hadn't produced coins to any great extent before this point. The timing of their introduction into the port city is also significant. There are no coins in use at the site until the second half of the 4th century BC, after which coin use rapidly increases. Now, this doesn't appear to be about beginning to use coins produced elsewhere, as this object that we discovered in Thonis-Heracleion makes clear. This is a coin die. It's an irregular bronze cube that has obverse dies for imitations of Athenian tetradrachms engraved into it. And these closely approximate late Athenian imitations produced by the Persian administration at the end of the 4th century. So they're counterfeiting Athenian coins. A bronze coinage also appears to be made in Egypt around this time as well, which was based on a coin type from Kition in Cyprus. These are found in large quantities in Thonis-Heracleion. Indeed, in Heracleion, we have about 4 times more than have been found at Kition itself. So with the production of both higher silver and lower bronze denomination coinage in the city, we can see that the Persian administration are investing in a coin-based economy. It's also significant that if you look at the distribution of the pre-Ptolemaic coin finds, lots of them are found alongside the small Greek and Egyptian weights in the potential market area. So around here, which is around the sanctuary of Khonsou. So here we have all of the necessary ingredients for the growth of Thonis-Heracleion into, according to the historian Diodorus Siculus, the greatest trading port of Egypt. Now, the heyday of the trading port doesn't last too long. And after the conquest of Egypt by Alexander the Great, the economic function is reorientated away from Thonis-Heracleion and towards the new port of Alexandria. In Thonis-Heracleion, however, the cult economy becomes increasingly important after the flow of international trade ceases. as a place of significance in the Saïte religious landscape for the ceremony held there in which the kings received their royal legitimation from Ammon of the Ghareb. This continues to have resonance for the Ptolemies. These two colossal statues, both of which are around 5 meters tall, are of a Ptolemaic king and a queen, and they were discovered during survey work on the central island in the area of the main temple. Now, these would have stood before its facade, watching over it and allowing the king's subjects to worship him. The figures are upright, and they're striding towards us with their backs against a pillar. And this is a very traditional form of Egyptian royal sculpture, which draws its inspiration from the New Kingdom and from the later Saïte period. The king holds in his right hand the Mekhes case, which is just in here. And the Mekhes case is important because it contains the inventory of Egypt that confirmed legitimate sovereignty over the country. And this emphasizes the important role that this temple plays in dynastic continuity. Now, interestingly, the two statues appear to have been recarved. Early Ptolemaic sculpture is at great pains to conform to Egyptian classical norms, so as not to suggest the Greek origins of their rulers. With time, however, as the dynasty becomes less foreign and Egypt more Hellenistic, it becomes more acceptable for Greek elements to be portrayed. So consequently, the faces of the rulers were recarved with the broad face and thin lips of a king, and this is possibly Ptolemy VIII. Further evidence for the growth of a new Hellenistic form of Egyptian city can be seen in this gold dedicatory plaque, made in the name of Ptolemy III and his family. It documents the gift of a commissarium, which is a Hellenistic festival hall to the city. Unfortunately, although we found the foundation plaque, we don't know what this structure would have looked like, although we can suspect it was an appropriately Hellenistic building. But this style of architecture is revealed elsewhere in the city, and on the southern banks of the central island, excavations, which you can see here, have revealed Greek-style columns and a small Tholos temple. Consequently, a distinctly Egypto-Hellenistic city is being formed, from its everyday material culture through to its monumental sculpture and architecture. By now, Egyptian Thonis had become Greek Heracleion, and the importance of this god to the city is further emphasized on this plaque through the dedication of the commissarium to the god Heracles. So the distinctly Hellenistic city of Heracleion was destroyed in a cataclysmic event at the end of the 2nd century BC. The temples on the central island collapse in an episode of sedimentary liquefaction, with rubble flowing down and engulfing a number of ships tied up at the wharfs around it. And this is a tragedy which the city never recovers from. It leads to its large-scale abandonment and the robbing of much of what remained of its architecture. But because we've looked at the city in these three phases, it's become possible to trace how Saïte Thonis becomes Ptolemaic Heracleion. During the early period of contact between the Hellenic and the Egyptian worlds, we see a process of interpretation, where both populations sought to understand the other through emphasizing the familiar. Here we can see the incorporation of the shores of Egypt into Greek stories, and the association of the temple of Khonsou with Heracles and the first construction of Heracleion in Greek eyes. While Greek merchants brought with them goods, and in the Saïte period, these simply appear to have been used in explicitly Egyptian ways, and the actual Greek presence in the city seems quite transient or limited to mercenaries. While the number of foreigners arriving on the shores of Egypt would have increased throughout the Saïte period, it's only following the Persian invasion that major changes are clearly observable in Thonis-Heracleion. These are mainly associated with the transferal of the market, the main emporium, to the port, and the development of a market with a monetary economy and a weight system that accompanies it. At this time, Thonis-Heracleion is an intermediary between three cultures, between Egypt, Greece, and the Persian Empire. While Athenian tetradrachms may have been counterfeited in the port, so too are coins from Persian Kition. Finally, while the conquest of Egypt by Alexander may well have signaled the end of the emporium in Thonis-Heracleion, Continued donations by the new ruling dynasty resulted in the growth of a distinctly Ptolemaic city with its cult-based economy. Yet it's a city that's fundamentally still attached to its Egyptian heritage. There is change, but there's also a great deal of continuity. And it should come as no surprise that while the Decree of Canopus may refer to the city as Heracleion, its content is resolutely Egyptian. It concerns the life of the temple and the celebration of the mysteries of the god Osiris. The difference now is that as part of the nautical procession of the Lord of the Underworld, a deceased Ptolemaic princess sails alongside the god, and this neatly entwines the worlds of Greece and Egypt on the waters of the Hone at the edge of the Sea of the Greeks. And that was my paper. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Damien. That's fantastic. That is just some remarkable items that you've been showing us. While you have that page up, can you tell us more about, is this a mosaic or a painting?
This is a mosaic from the sanctuary of Fortuna Primigera, just outside Rome, and it's a view of the Nile Delta in the sort of the Hellenistic period. So it's got Egyptian-style temples. It's got interesting kind of buildings collapsing into the sea, but it's also got Greek-style temples with what look like Greek soldiers, Greek warships, Egyptian ships. So it really portrays really very nicely for me this kind of melding of different cultures in the Nile at this time.
So really, the international world that we live in is reflected back in ancient times as well. It was very international back then too.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, we have time for a few questions, so please feel free to write any that you have in the question panel. But I'm going to slip in with a few questions before I ask any others that have been written down. I'm quite fascinated by these 5-meter high statues that you found. How on earth did they, well, they look like they're not underwater anymore. So where are they, and how on earth did you get them from under the water to being on land?
Well, first of all, if we just have a quick look here, you can see that you have the big statues around the temple pylon depicted on the mosaic. But the statues themselves, if I can go back to them, they're actually found in pieces when Frank Goddio and his team originally discovered them. And so they were brought up using airbags and then to a lifting barge, and they were put onto the lifting barge. At the moment, these statues are in Richmond, in Virginia, in the United States. We have a traveling exhibition, and they're as part of that. These statues have been all around the world. So they've been to Japan, they've been to various places around Europe, America. They're very well traveled nowadays.
Ah, right. Were they part of the British Museum exhibition that was on a year or two ago? Absolutely,
yeah. They were in the British Museum.
Fantastic. We've got a question from the audience saying lots of people saying how fantastic it was. So thank you very much. One question is, how long will archaeological work continue there?
It's quite interesting because my colleague Frank says that he estimates that he's looked at perhaps 1% of the city in detail in terms of excavation. So the majority of the work that is undertaken is there's a lot of survey work with very small scientific sort of excavations to answer specific questions. So in terms of detailed long-term excavation, it can just go on and on and on. So there's lots of things for kind of future generations of archaeologists to still discover at the moment. So for example, we've discovered over 70 ancient shipwrecks from the city, but have only excavated scientifically a couple of them. So the rest have been discovered during survey. And Frank is quite clear that we're not going to just dig them all up. You know, we're putting them aside for the future. So so that we don't. So you know, there's a lot of in situ preservation that goes on here as well.
That's fantastic, and good to know that there's things for future generations of archaeologists to work on as well. But 1%,
absolutely.
that's such a small amount.
Yeah, it is, and this site can continue to, as we know more about it, we're able to ask different and more interesting questions about it. So a lot of the early work was about survey, but now Frank is able to ask much more specific kind of issues about the city. Now that we have a kind of dating and structural framework for it, so the questions that we're going to be asking in the future are going to be even more interesting than the ones that we're able to look at the moment. Hopefully.
Well, that's baffling because they're already pretty interesting questions that you're working on there. I've got one final question from the audience. There's a question about understanding the geology of the submergence. Has that been investigated?
It absolutely has. So it was originally looked at by colleagues from the Smithsonian. We've done cores from across the Agbukia Bay area, and so we've got a pretty good idea of the rate of the submergence and the processes that are involved. And it's these twin processes of the slow, steady compaction of the Nile Delta sediments, and then the problem of building a city on the top of these unstable sediments. And then if you have earthquakes or heavy Nile floods or something like that, sometimes you do get these catastrophic collapses of the sediment, which resulted in the final destruction of the city. So we are able to look at that. At the moment, we have French colleagues who are, again, they've gone back to these cores that we took probably about 15 years ago, 20 years ago now, and are starting to redocument and reinterpret the whole submergence process as well. So that's very exciting for us as well, because we'll be able to kind of compare these two phases of scholarship to see what's happening.
That's fantastic. Well, thank you very much for your time, for your presentation today. And if anyone's in Richmond, Virginia, you can go and see the exhibition, it seems, and who knows where else it might go around the world. So thanks very much for your talk today. And for those in the audience, if you've enjoyed today's talk, please remember that we will have another one next week. So on the 4th of August, we will have Eileen Clegg talking from the National Museum of the Royal Navy. And I understand that she actually is going to be showing us some brand new old artifacts from the Invincible, if that makes sense. So make sure to tune in next week, same time, and we'll hear about something a little bit more modern, but still very historic and interesting on the HMS Invincible. And if you have enjoyed today's talk and are able to, please do consider making a donation towards the running costs of this series. So this can be done on the website or by texting nautical 5 to 70085. And hopefully we'll see you next week at Eileen Clegg's talk. So have a lovely day. Thank you very much.